Imagine a world without warnings, without satellites, without any means to protect you from the sudden wrath of nature. A world where there was nothing but you, the earth trembling beneath your feet, and the waters rising to swallow everything. This documentary will reveal strange strategies, primitive techniques, and secrets so ancient that they will help you relax and surrender to sleep. Listen quietly and let your mind sink into an era of struggle where the human mind was the last line of defense. When the earth shook beneath their feet without warning, humans faced a destructive force before which the mightiest buildings crumbled. But some ancient civilizations found strange and ingenious solutions to resist these disasters. They did not rely on reinforced concrete or steel, but on an intuitive understanding of materials and their properties. In ancient Japan, for example, engineers invented what is known as flexible or swaying temples. These structures were built of wood using complex joinery techniques that connected the timbers without nails, giving them immense flexibility. The idea was that the building would not resist the earthquake, but dance with it. The wooden pillars were fastened together in a way that allowed them to move and twist with the earth's vibrations, preventing collapse. This strange and intelligent design was the secret to these buildings' survival. In other regions, like the Ottoman Empire, domes and minarets were built to move slightly during an earthquake, which reduced the pressure on them and prevented them from falling. These simple solutions, relying on an understanding of materials more than engineering force, are what preserved their heritage from destruction. When rivers overflowed and swept away everything in their path, floods represented a major catastrophe, destroying crops, demolishing homes, and claiming lives. Humans in the past did not have massive dams or early warning systems, but they developed strange and clever ways to coexist with these disasters. They did not fight the water, they learned to dance with it. In areas known for strong, destructive, seasonal floods like Southeast Asia, people did not fight the water but learned to build their houses in a way that allowed them to remain intact despite rising water levels. Houses were built on very tall wooden stilts raised several meters above the ground, allowing the floodwaters to pass underneath without causing significant damage. These houses were known as stilt houses and were made from light, natural materials, like bamboo and wood, giving them flexibility to deal with the strong winds accompanying floods. Access was via movable wooden ladders that were raised when the water level rose to prevent predators or insects from reaching the inhabitants. In other areas, like Venice, Italy, the entire city was built on wooden foundations submerged in salt water. These foundations consisted of thousands of wooden piles driven into the seabed, upon which layers of stone and clay were placed to form a solid base for the buildings. The city's foundations adapted to the movement of the tides and grew stronger, over time, giving them a stability that ordinary land foundations could not provide. This strange building method did not fight the water but used it to its advantage. And in other regions, like the low-lying Netherlands, perpetually prone to flooding, the inhabitants invented another way to deal with water. Instead of building elevated houses, they built small dikes around their villages and farms, then used windmills to pump excess water from the farmland into canals. These innovative solutions, which seem strange and primitive, are what enabled these civilizations to withstand the mighty forces of nature and show that flexibility and adaptability were more important than strength in facing disasters. When plagues struck cities and villages, they caused indescribable terror. People had no idea about germs or infection and believed these diseases spread through polluted air, miasma, or evil spirits. This scientific ignorance drove them to resort to strange and unconventional methods to confront illness. One of the strangest of these methods was the plague doctor's mask, which aimed not only for protection but combined superstition and treatment. Doctors wore thick leather coats and put on masks shaped like a bird's beak. This beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs like lavender, mint, and rosemary. The prevailing belief was that these strong, fragrant herbs would purify the foul air and protect the doctor from infection. Although this mask had no real medical benefit, it gave the doctor a false sense of security and mitigated the smell of death permeating everything. Besides this, people resorted to other strange rituals to combat the plague. They burned aromatic herbs and incense in the streets, believing the smoke would drive away the polluted air. Sometimes they would ring bells continuously, believing their powerful sound would repel the evil spirits causing the disease. In other cases, families resorted to harsh self-isolation. Infected families would shut themselves inside their homes, and red marks were placed on their doors to warn others, ensuring the disease did not spread, but simultaneously leading to the death of all family members inside. All these solutions, whether strange or cruel, showed human despair in the face of an invisible enemy. These methods were a reflection of a mindset still trying to understand the world and use any available means, no matter how primitive, to survive. When the sky withheld its rain, lands dried up and turned into barren deserts, and famine raised its grim head, threatening the lives of entire communities. In a world where food imports were not readily available, food security depended on people's ability to store what they harvested in good seasons, which drove them to invent solutions so strange they were buried deep within the earth. They did not rely on the elevated silos we know. Instead, they turned to building giant underground storage facilities known as silos or underground cisterns. These silos were dug into the soil and often lined with clay or straw to prevent moisture from reaching the grains. They were designed to allow natural ventilation to preserve the quality of the harvest. The idea was that the stable temperatures deep within the earth protected the grains from sudden weather changes and kept away pests like rats and insects, ensuring the crop remained fit for consumption for many long years. Opening these silos was a celebratory ritual representing the hope of survival from famine. The matter was not limited to storing grains, but extended to storing water as well. In arid regions, people invented complex systems of underground cisterns, dug manually to great depths, to collect and store rainwater. These cisterns were covered with layers of stone to prevent evaporation and were sometimes connected to underground channels for water distribution. These cisterns were the lifeline of cities and a symbol of resilience in the face of drought. Some were enormous, like those beneath Roman and Byzantine cities, sufficient to provide water for thousands of inhabitants. These hidden water systems, invisible from the surface, are what saved them from thirst. These strange solutions, relying on disappearing beneath the Earth's surface to store either food or water, were not just techniques, but a complete philosophy on how to deal with nature. They show that humans did not just face disaster when it came. They prepared for it with intelligence and depth, using the Earth itself as a final fortress against drought and famine. When the Earth awoke from its slumber, not with a mere tremor, but with a thundering rage, spewing fire and smoke from its depths, volcanoes represented an existential threat to humans. The sight of flowing lava, ash, blotting out the sun, and toxic gases filling the air was beyond the human mind's capacity to understand, leading them to strange interpretations in a time before geology existed. Many ancient civilizations believed volcanoes were a direct embodiment of the anger of the gods. In ancient Rome, people believed the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was due to the wrath of Vulcan, the god of fire, and so they offered him sacrifices, including precious animals, in a desperate attempt to appease his anger. These rituals were not limited to sacrifices, but extended to even stranger practices. In some cultures, inhabitants threw precious pieces of gold and jewelry into volcanic craters, believing these acts would bring satisfaction to the gods and prevent the catastrophe from happening. Despite these superstitious beliefs, humans also had surprisingly primitive and clever ways to try to predict eruptions. They observed nature very carefully and noticed certain patterns in animal behavior. Birds would leave the area days before an eruption, and domestic animals showed signs of anxiety and disturbance. They also noticed environmental changes, like rising water temperatures in springs near volcanoes or strange smells emanating from the earth. These observations, which they considered divine signals, were in fact preliminary scientific indicators of coming geological events. In other areas, some communities living in the shadow of volcanoes learned to coexist with this danger. They developed specific evacuation routes and stored supplies in safe places away from potential lava flows. Their entire lives were built on adapting to the threat, illustrating that the fear of nature was a major driver of innovation. When the sky turned a frightening orange and walls of dust and sand advanced, dust storms represented a silent but destructive threat. These storms choked crops, destroyed property, caused respiratory diseases, and were an existential threat. In deserts and arid regions, driving humans to invent strange but effective solutions to confront them. One of these solutions was what we might call living walls. Instead of building walls of mud or stone, farming communities in desert areas planted specific trees like tamarind or acacia in very dense, organized rows around their villages and farms. These trees were planted at calculated distances to form a huge natural barrier that could grow to great heights and withstand harsh conditions. When storms blew, these green walls acted as windbreaks, reducing their speed and power. The intertwined branches and leaves of the trees worked to trap dust and sand, preventing them from entering the villages and destroying crops. This strange method not only protected from storms but also helped stabilize the soil and prevent desertification. In other places, people resorted to even stranger solutions to protect themselves and their homes. They built underground shelters or tunnels, which were rooms dug deep into the earth and sealed with thick, tightly closing wooden doors. People would hide in these shelters during severe storms, finding safety from the sand and winds. These shelters were not just hiding places, they were also used to store supplies and precious belongings safe from the storms. These solutions, relying on nature itself, whether living walls or underground shelters, show that humans did not just face disaster when it came. They prepared for it with intelligence and depth, using their surrounding environment as a final fortress against the destructive forces of nature. When the earth shook beneath the ocean's surface, no one on land felt it. But moments later, the sea would retreat in a strange and terrifying way, revealing the ocean floor before returning in the form of a giant, unstoppable wave that devoured everything in its path. Humans in the past had no way to predict this catastrophe, but they relied on methods that were strange and frightening at the same time to face it. One of these methods was the tales of silent warning, stories and legends passed down from generation to generation. These stories were not just tales of sea monsters or the wrath of the gods, they contained very subtle hints about the signs of an approaching tsunami. The stories described how the sea would suddenly disappear and how birds and animals would flee to high ground, which was a signal for the community to immediately flee to nearby mountains or hills. These warnings were not limited to stories, but extended to careful observation of animal behavior. Fishermen and coastal residents noticed that fish would swim away from the shore in a strange manner before the wave arrived, and that birds would fly in a single flock inland. These observations acted as early warning systems based on instinct, more than science, and often saved the lives of an entire village. In some areas that experienced tsunamis frequently, the inhabitants resorted to strange building solutions. They built their main homes in high areas far from the shore, while they lived in temporary huts near the sea for work. This idea of a dual residence meant they were always ready to abandon their temporary dwellings at any moment and flee to their safe homes in the highlands at the first sign of danger. These methods, which seem strange and primitive to us now, are what enabled these civilizations to withstand one of nature's most formidable forces and show that myth and observation were powerful weapons against danger. When the sky darkened suddenly and the winds changed frantically, people knew a great force was approaching. There were no radars or early warning systems, just whirlwinds of destructive winds that uprooted trees and destroyed homes in moments. This mysterious danger drove humans to invent strange methods to confront this phenomenon, relying on sound. Burudo was a strange and common belief that a loud sound could break up and disperse hurricanes. In some European villages, people rushed to churches to ring the bells with all their might. The faith said that the sound of the holy bell would drive away the evil spirits causing the storm. The matter was not limited to bells. It extended to the use of cannons. In some areas, people fired cannon shots into the sky during the storm, believing the sound of the explosion would create sound waves capable of scattering the clouds carrying the hurricane. Despite the strangeness of these practices, they gave people a sense of hope and control in the face of an uncontrollable force. These sonic rituals were their last line of defense. Alongside these sonic defenses, some communities invented unique architectural methods for survival. Houses were built on very sturdy foundations and designed to be low, with steeply sloping roofs, reducing the surface area the wind could catch and tear away. Windows were made very small to minimize the chance of wind entering and creating pressure that would collapse the house. These methods, which seem strange and primitive to us now, are what enabled these civilizations to withstand one of nature's most formidable forces and show that myth and observation were powerful weapons against danger. In ancient and medieval times, there was no natural disaster more terrifying and astonishing than swarms of locusts that filled the sky and blotted out the sun. These massive swarms would descend on farmland and devour everything green in their path, leaving behind famines and barren land. This sudden invasion was an unstoppable catastrophe, driving humans to strange and irrational methods to resist it. One of these methods was sonic defense, a strange concept based on the belief that intense noise could disperse or frighten locust swarms. Villagers would rush to their fields carrying drums, pots, and metal pans and begin to create a hysterical cacophony. The idea was that the loud noise, mixed with human screams, would confuse the locusts and make them change course. Although there was no scientific evidence for this method's success, it gave people a sense of hope and collective action in the face of this uncontrollable danger. In other cases, villages resorted to trench and fire defense. Instead of trying to scare the locusts, they tried to stop them physically. This method required enormous effort, as the inhabitants would dig deep, wide trenches around their fields and then fill them with water or set them on fire. As the swarms advanced, the locusts would fall into the trenches and drown or burn, significantly reducing the number of insects reaching the crops. In some societies where all attempts failed, people resorted to a very strange solution: consuming the locusts. After these swarms devoured the crops, the inhabitants would collect the dead and surviving insects, roast or boil them, and consume them as a source of protein. These strange methods, ranging from the superstitious to the practical, are what enabled these civilizations to withstand a catastrophe that seemed endless and show that myth and observation were powerful weapons against danger. Mountains that seem silent and steadfast can collapse at any moment. Suddenly, A deep sound echoes from the heart of the rocks, and massive blocks of soil and ice move, burying everything in their path. These are landslides and avalanches, among the most silent of disasters because they often occur without visible warning, making them incredibly terrifying. To face this invisible danger, people who lived in the mountains developed strange ways to listen to the mountain's own pulse. Village elders taught new generations how to distinguish unfamiliar sounds in the night, like the faint sound of ice cracking deep in the mountains, or the sound of rocks moving very slowly. These sounds were considered early warning signs. The mountain was whispering that it was about to collapse. Despite the strangeness of these observations, they were astonishingly accurate, built on the accumulation of long experience living in these harsh mountain environments. Alongside this, there was another, even stranger method of warning. Residents would build simple wooden towers on slopes believed to be dangerous. These towers were not for guarding. They were designed to fall at the first sign of a landslide. These sacrificial towers were built with great care and placed in strategic locations to be the first affected by the avalanche, giving the villagers below a final warning to flee the coming catastrophe. They also planted specific types of trees, like pine trees, in a specific pattern on dangerous slopes. The roots of these trees acted as a strong natural network that held the soil and prevented it from sliding, significantly reducing the risk of landslides. These strange methods, combining listening to nature and intervening in it in primitive ways, are what enabled these civilizations to withstand one of nature's most formidable forces and show that myth and observation were powerful weapons against danger. Disasters were not limited to the earthly realm. The sky was also a source of terror and wonder. When comets suddenly appeared in the sky, or when meteors filled the night, these phenomena were interpreted as omens of doom, predictions of famine, plague, or even the end of the world. Humans looked upon the unknown sky with fear and invented very strange ways to try to influence it. In a time when science was still in its infancy, humans believed these celestial events were a direct embodiment of the anger of the gods or spirits. Therefore, rituals were the first line of defense. They performed acts of theater in an attempt to appease the atmosphere. They lit huge fires on high ground, not for warmth, but to imitate the light of comets, believing these acts would show their respect for the gods. They also performed collective dances and made specific sounds, believing the rhythm of their movements and voices could affect the path of celestial bodies and prevent them from causing a catastrophe. These strange rituals were a mixture of despair and hope in the face of an incomprehensible force. Additionally, people resorted to inventing strange shields to ward off disaster. Some civilizations would make large plates of polished metal or smooth stone. They would then raise these plates and point them towards the sky during the catastrophe. The belief was that these plates would reflect the negative or evil energy of the celestial force, making it return to its source. In some cultures, the early priests and astronomers tried to understand these celestial events in more organized ways, but not in the strict scientific sense. They drew detailed maps of the sky, not to predict the movement of planets, but to link them to earthly events. These maps were a record of prophecies and were used to interpret major events on Earth, like floods or famines, as resulting from specific celestial events, giving people a sense of knowledge, even if that knowledge was based on superstition. In crowded cities with narrow streets and wooden buildings, fire was not a potential danger, but a catastrophe waiting for an opportunity. A small spark from a hearth or a candle could turn within minutes into a merciless inferno, devouring everything in its path, making this disaster one of the deadliest humans faced in the past. They did not have fire hoses or fire trucks, but they invented strange methods that relied on collective effort and desperation. In some cities, there was a fire alarm bell, a giant bell rung in a specific pattern to alert all residents of danger. This bell was the signal to start a strange collective ritual where people would rush to rivers or wells and form very long human chains, passing buckets of water from the source to the fire in a frantic race against time. These chains stretched for hundreds of meters and required incredible cooperation from all members of the community, from children to adults, in a desperate attempt to stop the spread of the merciless flames. When water was not enough, even harsher and stranger decisions were made. This strategy was known as fire breaks, where buildings were completely demolished in the fire's path. People rushed with their hands, axes, and hammers to demolish their homes, not because they were on fire, but to prevent the fire from reaching them. The idea was to create an empty area with nothing flammable, which would stop the fire's advance. This method was harsh but very effective in saving the rest of the city. These events led to changes in how cities were built. After major fires, like the Great Fire of London, new building laws were imposed. Buildings were made of brick, and streets were made wider to prevent future fires. Sometimes, when all physical methods failed, people resorted to spiritual solutions. They would hold processions carrying holy statues or saints' relics and confront the flames with them, believing these objects had a supernatural spiritual power that could extinguish the fire.